really good sip of yours today. I try to make sure I get at least 2 cups in, right? Until I look like this. Mm. Alright, so there's a verse this is going through my head that I wanna do. I mean, I know it, but this is the way it reads. Truly, truly, I say to you, this is John 12:24. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. I would always, whenever I would do, being the pastor in the family, you always get called on to do the funerals. And so it's not my favorite thing at all to do, but it's always an opportunity because people are primed. And there's things that God does that really do prime us for a lot more to happen. Um, I want to read this one part, chapter 10. All right, here we go. It's from the Absent Man, and it's just one part. Um, in an earlier chapter, I explored the collision of Chronos, chronological time, and Kairos, divine appointed time, when explosive, history shifting events suddenly interrupt the steady drip of incremental change. Chronos moves slowly. It pushes culture along a continuum so gradually that we barely notice it. Even the self aware can wake up one day and ask, how did we get here? Then Kairos comes, catastrophic, clarifying, divine, or diabolic, and it accelerates everything. The explosion of technology is one example. It brought significant innovation, but fractured our capacity for presence and intimacy. Then came COVID, a global Kairos moment that altered everything overnight. I remember saying over and over to my wife and anyone who would listen, how did we stop the entire world in a day? We went from business as usual to lockdown, right? Mask, isolation, silence, the world ground to a halt. I was working in the school system and then saw firsthand what it did to kids. It gutted their motivation, it hollowed out their resilience, it pulled the plug on 2 years of critical development. COVID wasn't just a virus, it was a detonator. It rode on the back of years of incremental shifts that had already positioned us for collapse. It exposed the fault lines beneath our feet and revealed how deeply our foundations had already been fractured. The catalyst allowed a larger, more nefarious plan to surface, one bent on restructuring global systems and fracturing every form of communal belonging. The devastation wasn't just physical or economic, it was spiritual. Norms were uprooted, standards were shattered. We emerged into a world at war with itself, uncertain and unanchored. For many, it felt like waking up from a nightmare, only to discover the nightmare was real and it had been a long time in the making. This didn't start in 2020, it began in Eden. What COVID unleashed wasn't new, it was just unmasked. Lawlessness had long been brewing beneath the surface. The virus didn't create evil, it exposed it. For those like me who hadn't yet realized how extensive and organized the enemy's strategy had become, it felt like we went from everyday life into a lawless parade. Violence exploded, chaos erupted. I remember watching an elderly shop owner being brutally beaten to death during a looting spree. I watched it on my phone. I couldn't unsee it. Instagram became a showcase of senseless violence. It felt like humanity had unhinged itself, restraints had broken, and chaos erupted. Lawlessness went viral and love grew cold. People died in hospitals who were with no one allowed to say goodbye. Funerals were limited. Families were severed. We've barely grasped the sociological and psychological trauma this has caused. Studies will be written for years to come, but many of us lived it. Years ago, I attended a seminar. I don't remember the speaker's name, but I'll never forget what he said. When a culture reaches the point where bestiality and sex with the dead are depicted as entertainment, it's done. Today, on the dark web, you can find what's called snuff porn, videos of people being choked and killed during sex. My son told me about it. It's Is that not sex with the dead? We have a pedophilia epidemic ravaging the planet. What do you call sex with I gotta finish that sentence. With the soul of a child that's being murdered in the act. This is death packaged as pleasure. The pendulum must swing. This is all that, by the way, I'm reading from the Absent Man, this one part from the lawlessness chapter that was going through my brain. The pendulum must swing. It must swing hard back toward truth, morality, sanity, and the Father. The Bible says that when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Lord raises a righteous standard. Isaiah 59:19. We are watching that happen in real time. God, the Father, is turning hearts, children to their fathers, fathers to their children. The revival is not coming, it's here. It just doesn't look like what we expected. And I go on to talk about in that same chapter, kind of like what we saw in the land, what we've actually seen. And then I'm going to lead this up to this whole thing that we've witnessed with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It's like in a few short years, we saw The Chosen is the most beautiful depiction of Jesus ever filmed, sweeping across classrooms and living rooms. I showed it to every class before I left the school system. Praise the Lord. A Gen Z documentary where young people watch The Chosen without context. Um, right, they didn't know what they were watching. Many had church hurt, sexual trauma, or no faith background. Their one resounding takeaway: Jesus is so kind. They didn't know that. Sean Foy led us worship movement declaring Jesus as Lord across the country in defiance of lockdowns. I mean, not essentially in defiance of, but as a statement that you cannot destroy who we are as image bearers. We do function as people who are made in the image of God, and therefore, comma, we are not going to shut down. Then the release of Jesus Revolution, a powerful film showing the raw, messy, Holy Spirit saturated revival of the 1970s. Then we had the Asbury and the Lee University revivals, and a dozen other campuses ignited by spontaneous worship and repentance. Scroll through Instagram now and you'll see it. Worship in the streets. Last night I was watching Worship in the Streets in Italy. It was beautiful. Revival in every tongue and every nation. Love is the antidote to lawlessness and the key to healing both the narcissistic wound in our culture and the father wound in our souls is this: the love of a father who relentlessly pursues his children and penetrates their hearts. A generation still sings Foreigner's song, I want to know what love is, and I want you to show me. Love has come. His name is Jesus. He's also the Father, and he's coming after you and me. I've been pondering, and part of it was that I wasn't going to do this today because I don't have the language for what I want to actually say, but I'm grappling with language as part of what I'm doing here. And Um, I always had a correlation. I saw a correlation between what I saw as in narcissistic individuals and the way they functioned and the way that Scott Peck defined evil, which he basically defined evil as the unwillingness to examine one's own heart. So when you look at lawlessness and love grown cold, you can see that, as part of what we see in our culture. And in that chapter, when I talk about the pendulum has swung out so far and it is swinging back and it's going to swing back with such power that it's going to make our heads spin. But I remember just seeing that dynamic in a person. I saw it in a culture. I saw, if you ever encounter a narcissist, my joke is if you reject one, they'll try to make it their life mission to destroy you, metaphorically and otherwise, because their biggest wound is that they can't handle rejection. Rejection is the the wound that is so huge in them that they are so defended against. So they are essentially, um, the walls in the narcissist heart are extremely thick, and they resurrect and they reinvent, but they don't usually repent. Not easily. Now, in the context of what we see coming in what I think what revival will look like in many ways as the manifest sons and daughters of God take their place and just be the revival wherever they go, we're going to see hearts change quicker. Part of what happened in the revival in Toronto was it was a heart changing one. I've talked about this before about how people would go there and they hated each other in their marriage and they'd come out after being glued on the floor. Or as Rodney Howard Brown put it, we just got to get them under the anointing and the rest is God's, responsibility. And they would come out of that and they would have something different inside of them that they didn't have before. And so it was simply just God working on them as they were under the unction of the Holy Spirit. In other words, they're glued to the floor. They're in a spot where, he can get a little bit of time with us, right? And in that moment when you can do nothing except receive, if that's what you are, if you're bent towards receiving, which I always was, um, then you receive whatever the Lord wants to impart. And so mountains move in the context of glory. And when presence is thick and glory is present, things that could never move begin to move. And so part of what happens when you look at this thing that we've looked at for years, the lawless parade and the kind of the assassination culture that's been, we've been seeing growing and this ever pervasive move towards violence. That's the thing I've been trying to wrap my head around. I knew when I was writing The Absent Man, like, I knew that there was, like what Leanne Payne says, when the image of the Father is desecrated, there will be lawlessness. I knew that as we grew more and more untethered from, the security and the connection of the godly institution called family, that we would see the result of that in what we would see in all of the sexual brokenness and fluidity and the trans culture, the whole 9 yards. It's all really a product of that untethering from family and the fatherlessness that we see in our culture. But there's more to it than that. There's so much more to it than that. And so I've been trying to really I've been listening to some different people, their books and stuff on Audible that aren't necessarily Christians, but they've got language for things that have happened incrementally in our culture, because there have been incremental things that have moved our culture into the place that we are. We wouldn't accept the things that came with COVID and all of that if we weren't already moved into a place. We wouldn't accept, all of this thing with, trans culture, everything. And, because we made this major shift out of identity politics into something much more nefarious, in my opinion. identity politics was where the left used to be, right? So all of the letters and the groups and races were all protected, right? And I've talked about this before, but I remember it was during the COVID time. There was a guy, I forget his name. I'll think of it in a second, but he was a comedian, okay, and he was Jewish and he was gay, and he was going to UCLA Berkeley to speak. And all right, so traditional identity politics. The guy had the letters. He was gay, right? He was Jewish. I mean, they should have received him, right? He should have been okay, right? Because what identity politics did was it protected, various minority groups, but to the exclusion and often with the accusation um that somehow, we were all just oppressed, and all white people were racist, like if you're a white male, my God, you're racist, you know what I mean? And so we've been infused with this kind of thinking, which has been the goal has been to divide, conquer, separate, all those things, right? It's to create this tension in the mix that's so palpable. So then, so what he did was when he went to speak, there were bricks already there, ready for them. They had been delivered, and they basically threw bricks through the windows and lit the college on fire, over him speaking. That's when I knew that there was a shift. The shift wasn't, um, it shifted to a war against righteousness, okay? Okay, so I had this discussion with a friend today, so it's very interesting. Because when you talk about lawlessness and righteousness, you really don't put that you can put that to a degree in certain parties politically, but the truth is it exists in both. We know that. And the truth is that the war really is about righteousness and lawlessness and this love grown cold that we see in our culture. But you do tend to have people stack up, if you will, in a party where in terms of conservative values, right? If you basically say, "Hey, not everybody has to be a Christian in it either," but it's like, "Hey, we don't want abortion. We don't think that's right. We believe in one gender. We believe in, sanctity of life, which is, abortion. We believe in you know, oh, what are some things we line up with on the whole, in terms of just we believe in family. We believe in, like the wholesomeness of family. We believe in preserving family. We believe in promoting life, etc. So when you line up with things with conservative values, you do tend to line up more in one camp. Again, that doesn't mean that the camp is all good. It just means that if we only had two parties, which is all we have, right? So you're either going to be in one or the other, and there are extremes in both. There is a far right, there is a far left, and the further left you go, the more communist it becomes, right? Just look at the guy that's running for the mayor of New York. And so my point isn't to get all political with it, but as much as to say that the true war, if you're looking at it biblically, is about lawlessness and righteousness. And the war is against righteousness. So it's it and I said all that about the political thing to say it was conservative people that tended to be Christians. A larger percentage of conservatives tend to be Christians that were being deplatformed, that were being shut down, that were being shut up, while this evil agenda was being pushed on us from every level. And so what we have to know, and we know it in varying degrees. I remember when Tucker Carlson was talking about, just, kind of waking up to some things. And he was just basically talking about, I didn't know how evil it was. I didn't know that it was nefarious. I didn't know that there was an agenda that had been being driven and built incrementally over time. That's why when Kairos moments intersect Chronos moments, they could be diabolical, they could be holy, they could be any of those things. But what they do is they interrupt the standard timeline and they bring something that is catastrophically good or catastrophically bad, or you can have some things happening that are both good and bad. The devil's always trying to do something, and God's trying to do something as well, which is why historically revival has always been a kairos kind of smashing in event. And what did it usually produce? It usually produces in a culture a turning. If you look at historical revivals, you'll have people in the culture have an awakening of such that they're turning from sin. You'll see cities clean up. You'll see people stop drinking. If you get the whole story behind the Ryman theater in Nashville, and there's a story that's built into that whole existence of that thing. It was actually started for purposes to promote the gospel. The guy that was opposing was actually got saved at the revival. The one that was like, I think he was the owner of it, and he was like, not the owner of the necessarily the Ryman, but he was pushing the whole debauchery and drinking thing in Nashville during a time. He kind of owned a lot of the people in the town, and so things got shifted when he got saved. So when bad characters get saved, there are big shifts that come even then. There are so many bad characters right now that I believe that are on heaven's agenda. I mean, Jesus wants them all, right? Jesus likes the bad guys too. Okay, Jesus died for the sinners. He died for the guys that are creating all the havoc. He died for the deep state. He died for all of the agenda driven stuff that comes with this Marxist regime that we've been, this whole thing of deep state that we've been fighting, not knowing fully what it was that we were fighting, but it's become the mask kind of got ripped off. So when lawlessness is allowed, then lawlessness becomes even bigger and greater. What we saw during, the previous 4 years was there was no mask on it anymore. I mean, it was just outright contempt and hate. So there's this agenda that has been purely, I mean, you got to think about this from a sociological perspective a little bit. What is it in a culture that actually wants or tolerates something that has been driven by absolute hate? When you break down things politically, it's not been about policies. Democrats and Republicans used to be able to have, lively discussions. And it was always about policy. When you went to the vote, you were voting over policy. You were voting over what you thought that candidate was going to do. You weren't, you weren't going there, you weren't fighting an evil regime. The left used to look like, more liberal on social issues, right? Maybe fiscally less conservative, wanting the government to have more involvement in programs, et cetera, et cetera. So you were fighting some basic things, it was policy driven. And so the debates and the conversations were really about that. Then we go into this period of time, which we just came out of, where you couldn't talk about anything. If you talked against the party line, if you talked against anything, you were told to shut up. I'm I mean, you just weren't allowed. You weren't allowed to bring up hydrochloroquine. You weren't allowed to bring up, ivermectin. You weren't allowed to bring up any conversation about the mask except that, we had to have it. You weren't allowed to talk about any of those things. And when I look back sometimes, I can't I'm befuddled at how severe things actually got and how much control was exercised, and then how much racial divide. Like, we were doing our supernatural ministry school at the church we were in, and we had some wonderful African American ladies that were in our school, and we honestly spent the bulk of our time in our ministry school together processing all the stuff from Floyd on, and just kind of needing a place to process it. And then you have things like, that information has been messed with. Like, where do you find truth? Where do you find information? How do you actually find out what's going on? Because there's this whole propaganda thing that's been going on in media. I used to sit there and I would think, okay, If I watched 8 hours of news and the entire news segment for the day was to hate on Trump, wouldn't you ask yourself a question somewhere in there like, this could be propaganda. This might not be right. There's something wrong here because what it became was it became just hate Trump. Now, here's what I think it really is. Now, I'm not going to speak to his righteousness. I do think he's a man that prophetically was going to go into the office and become a man of prayer. And I think he's become that man, particularly after Pennsylvania. I do think that he has a relationship with Jesus. I, on the front end, he didn't look like that. And a lot of people had a lot of problem with that. He was an outsider. He was all those things. So he came into this mix and he didn't look like, so spotless. And, he may not be spotless completely now either, but that's my point is simply that you had somebody come in who was disrupting and breaking up all the evil. If you ever saw the documentary Outer Shadows, it was what I call the primer for kind of seeing things. It was done by, narrated by basically a predominantly one stuntman in Hollywood. And what he did was he was in all the big movies. He was a stuntman, all the Batman, everything. And he was doing like a normal, run of the mill stunt one day and he broke something that affected his pelvic region, which of course for men and women both that region is very important for a lot of reasons, right? So he was going through like pelvic floor recovery and he was dealing with a woman that they never showed. They only showed her voice, they didn't show her face, and she was helping him with some pelvic floor, recovery, whatever they do whatever they do with their pelvic floor. So at any rate, he needed to do physical therapy. So she was processing through some things with him. But her primary thing that she did was she worked with satanically ritually abused people, kids, and she helped put them back together again. So the things that she had seen and the people, the kids that she worked with were it was just unbelievable. And she was a Christian and he was not. And she would pray for him. And he says on the documentary, I didn't become a Christian just because, you know, um, I didn't become a Christian. Um, I didn't go into this as a Christian. I went into this thing to explore some things, and this is what I came out with. And what he did was he recognized that there were some things in Hollywood that just didn't seem right. And so what he hold on, I'm trying to type one thing. And so he set up all these fake social media accounts, or a couple of them, um, and he began to investigate. And he saw symbols. He saw some of the symbolism, and he saw the demonic the whole thing with the satanic stuff. And so he began to see some of the things that like they put in your face, like they kind of wear it out there openly. And then he got involved in just doing his own research. And so on that same documentary, they had Liz Crokin, who was actually a reporter for the mainstream legacy media, and they basically kicked her out um, because she started reporting on Pizzagate, which is all about the pedophilia and the elites, right? They were all these people, adults having sex with kids. And she would read emails and she was seeing some of the things, like they began to investigate some things. And she would talk about how, you can have a massage for a half an hour or an hour, but you don't have a pizza for an hour, which pizza was a pedophilia term. And so um, I just want to see. Um, I just want to look up something about. All right, I was just trying to find something about real quick, but it's hard to find anything real quick when you're just trying to find something real quick. Um, but anyway, when she started reporting on that, they got rid of her. It highlights the speech, with Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes, where he basically calls all the Hollywood people out as pedophiles and says a lot of other things to them, which was hilarious. But the documentary kind of took you down, through the CIA, through the 6 main families that were pretty much running things in terms of the globalist and the banking and everything. It was giving you this kind of, peeking behind, it's kinda like the Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain, but we it gave you this big look behind the curtain of what was really being going on and how, like, a lot of your Hollywood elites were owned. It showed the, Abramovich woman who is the adrenochrome queen, and her training of Lady Gaga. They showed footage of her, her being her big disciple. And so, in this whole Hollywood thing, fascination with, adrenochrome, soul cooking dinners where they're eating food that looks like people. And so you're starting to see some of the things that are, kind of behind things that we're seeing in our culture and what's been driving it. And so what happened with Trump was this: you had somebody that began to break up their network. And part of what he's been doing, hard and fast in this first term is basically tearing down parts of the network. I mean, drying up their money sources, all the investigations that are taking place, things that are changing the landscape, so he came in as someone who's a disruptor. And basically, that's why people wanted him. They relied on the open border for what? Because they were essentially trying to change the entire demographic of the country so that we could never have a free election again. And so all the things that he's gone after, are things that we needed to see happen to have this pendulum swing. And so here's what I want to say about that pendulum. A lot of people have a big trouble with this whole thing called Christian nationalism and how to view, Christians who are for Trump. And then you got really obnoxious Christians who, marry the two together like too much. We worship Jesus, we don't worship the president. But you have to recognize prophetically what God is doing when what he's doing and putting somebody in. There are leaders all through the Bible who didn't have it all together. Cyrus was one of them. He wasn't necessarily a believer. He was somebody that God used. And so God does use people and use leaders to do things that he's trying to promote and do in the land, if you will. So if you have somebody who's righteous in the spot, I'll give you another example. Look at El Salvador. That president is a Christian. It was the most dangerous place to be. There's a phenomenal interview with that president and Tucker Carlson, I believe, where he talks about how the whole country changed because they prayed. They were going into a meeting, like a cabinet type meeting, and it started with a prayer. And when they prayed, it like everything began to change. I think Trump even made a comment recently about El Salvador, being one of the safest places to live. They don't have the crime. They were eaten up with it. A lot of Latin American countries like that have like cartels, and a lot of things are happening that are just like crazy, like dangerous going on, and they're very, challenging places to be. I remember having a student from Colombia in our school in Florida, and the mom came in and she was so excited because that they were there, because she said the place, and this isn't every country, but it's like a lot of countries around the world. We are very fortunate. And she said at night we would hear gunshots, and it was just trauma for us. And here we could go to sleep and we don't hear it, and we feel safe. And so, like, there are a lot of people around the world that go to bed at night and don't feel safe. So essentially, he turned the whole country around by prayer. So when you recognize that God is doing something that is setting the stage for the righteous, um, the righteous standard to continue to be raised, because that is what's happening. So here we are. We go through this time where we have these revival, at Asbury, we have the um the chosen coming out, painting a new picture of who Jesus is. We had Sean Foyt during, all of the lettuce worship, etc. So God's been building a stage for the pendulum to swing really hard in the other direction. And it's these kairos moments that when they happen, when he intervenes, or things happen that bring about a shift, you know, those are things that can move that pendulum so much faster and so much harder. So it's like we've had a lot of them. A lot of the ground that has been prepared is, number one, you have more righteousness in leadership in a country. That is always helps set the stage, obviously, for revival, because you want to have righteous men and women in positions of authority, not just in the White House, but across everywhere. You want to have manifest sons and daughters of God in every mountain of culture, everywhere you are. So there's a shift that takes place in how we are functioning as a people that lines up with the shift that's taking place in our culture. We are functioning as manifest sons and daughters of God who live from our union. We're not in a hierarchical structure. We're not the man of God at the top. Those structures are crumbling. We are living in the reality of, I know um who I am, my identity. I am the shift. I am the revival. I am the walking manifestation of the kingdom. When you have manifest sons and daughters of God who all get a hold of that reality, it changes the landscape, because then revival doesn't have to be just about getting to this location in order to get something that God's pouring out. And then I've got to go there and I've got to get it. And then I could come over here and give it away. The shift is you are it. So everywhere you go, there is this potential for things to happen. It happens with my wife and I all the time. She's had she goes into get she goes in for any kind of therapy for stuff that she's dealing with, and the whole place is turned upside down and they're all praising Jesus before she leaves. I mean, she goes into to the we go to the eye doctor, and like we're praying for everybody while we're there, and and I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, prayers that have been changing people's lives when glory is being infused into the planet. And honestly, when the manifest sons and daughters are just manifesting, it makes what we do very easy. Part of the way that that you're stepping into um the first fruits of revival is the ease with which things happen. It's not hard to share Jesus. And coming out of COVID, what you had a people, there was a level of awaking and a sleeping giant, even in that. People wanted their time back, they wanted their money back, you have the biggest entrepreneurial age ever getting birth post COVID. Why? I don't want to be somebody's boss. I don't want to be in a system. I want my freedom back. I want to make my own money. I want to be in my own business. So it's like one of the biggest entrepreneurial ages ever. So people came out of that. And it's normal for people to come out of that and want some semblance of normalcy again. But there's a deeper longing that's deeper than just normalcy. We want we want to see a reformation in our culture, right? We have something bigger in us that's more kingdom oriented. We want to see a righteous shift that moves the pendulum like way to the other side. So we swung out and we embraced, you know, everything you could think of. If you want to just think about why we were trans everything for 4 years, that's what happened. Everything became about mental illness and this thing called trans everything, right? Everything was about the letters and trans. not judging the people, not even not loving the people. Loving people is not a problem. But what the enemy has wanted to do on this whole sexual landscape is destroy the image of God inside of us and destroy our identity permanently so that we don't know who we are at all. That's the enemy's ultimate goal in every form of trauma and every form of sexual sin and engagement and all the types of things that people in the whole trans thing. The trans thing is like moving certain things that would be more normalized in our culture and just pushing it out. So now we're not just same sex attracted, we don't know if we belong in the same body or not. You see what I'm saying? And it was this movement. Think about what it was doing. We're gonna destroy people's genitals, and we're gonna push this change. Any book that you pick up about anybody that has made that transition, you're gonna see nothing but grief and heartache in their stories. In fact, this next book that we're doing, The Image Bearer, is all about the healing of men, and it's gonna focus on a lot of these things. But it's like you'll see nothing but heartache. The Here's the basic problem: you don't mess with God's design and not have a problem. You don't mess with, like, in other words, you can normalize as much as you want all this crazy fluid sexual stuff and trans everything as much as you want in a culture. But the thing you can't normalize is the fact that we are made in the image of God, and there is no way that we are ever going to feel at home in our own bodies when we are living inconsistent with the design of heaven that we were made for. It's a design flaw, and I'm saying that in a fun way. It's a design flaw. If you're made in the image of God, then you're never gonna be at home in your own skin unless you're living from the blueprint of heaven for who you were created to be. So any aberration of who you were created to be is going to create great dis-ease on the inside of you, and it's going to dis-ease is the prelude to mental illness because we're at dis-ease. So you're not going to feel at home in your own body. You can try to normalize it in a culture and do all whatever, but basically this has been a the trans everything has been an attack against the image of God at the core of man and woman, and it's an attempt to destroy who we are. If you can screw me up on the inside so many ways sideways that you destroy me mentally, physically, my psyche, everything, and you change my body, and I don't know who I am, do you not think that that's not a seedbed for mental illness? It's the biggest seedbed for mental illness because you're messing with the design. And when you mess with the design of who we are, created in his image, male and female, when you mess with that design, you create mental illness, period. You cannot mess with the design and then change people's bodies. So one of the things that I see on my Instagram feed, because I start liking certain things and you start seeing those things, and I wanted to see these things, is people who are transitioning back after meeting Jesus. So you'll have people on there like, I met Jesus and I got rid of my implants. A male who had implants for breast. Now he doesn't have them. He's falling in love with Jesus. And what they're doing, here's where it's like the Gathering demoniac generation. You're seeing people flip like completely into Jesus. The thing that's different in this era too is in my era we did nine. I mean, I still go through inner healing and I still have sessions with people where things happen. It's not that we don't stop doing that or that that's not part of the mix. But here's what it is: the more glory infused the culture becomes, the easier these shifts into our identity take place. So if I have been misaligned in my identity because I've had my genitals mutilated or I've been in the process of transitioning one direction or another, then those and then what that's done to my interior psychologically, emotionally, mentally, those shifts would typically involve, like, 900 years of therapy, 900 inner healing sessions, and what's happening, and you're seeing it. People go into the baptismal waters and they come out and they're not trans anymore. They go into the baptismal waters and they're not having gender dysphoria anymore. They go into Jesus is integrating people fully on the spot in ways much like the Gadarene demoniac who got delivered and then went to become the evangelist into 10 cities. So on Instagram, these are the new evangelists. These evangelists, if you want to categorize them, if you want to think about evangelists in the gender dysphoria arena, okay? The ones that are switching back out of their because they're having an encounter with Jesus, they would show themselves as a very effeminate, kind of female thing, their whole persona as a trans person, as a I don't even know how all the letters there, how everything works, but basically impersonating being and looking more like a woman than a man. And suddenly they've got this picture of them after Jesus and they're in the gym and they look fully like a man because here's one part of that. When you have the disruption and untethering from family and a fatherless generation and the breakdown and the fragmentation of family, what you get is a fragmentation in identity in the culture. And when you have that kind of fragmentation and identity, you have people living out of deficit wounds, places that have yet to be affirmed by a parent that's present or a parent, a parent, I don't want to say a substitute, but there are good people that come into equations that make family all the time that aren't necessarily blood family. And what you do is you have a lot of people trying to complete developmental phases in themselves and trying to complete things in their own identity. In other words, they feel the gender insecurity, they feel the disconnect with the gender. And so, what they're really doing and all of the things that they're doing sexually is trying to complete themselves. Romans 1 talks about it really well. When they looked at the creature rather than the creator, he gave them over to every kind of depraved mind. So, to the degree that there is the abandoning of of worship of the creator and the turning to the creature to tell me who I am, to the degree that you do that, that any of us do that, is the degree to which we will become more depraved, hence mental illness. So when people are saying that trans is a form of mental illness, they're absolutely right. You cannot mess with the design and screw around with the design on every level, mentally, emotionally, and physically, and not have mental illness and not have great gaps that need healing. So you're going to be a mess with people can only be a mess when you do that with them and when they do that with themselves. So what Jesus does, and so you have people, let me say it this way, if in the places where they aren't connected to their own gender, part of what they're doing is trying to connect and they're trying to complete something in themselves. They feel like there's a part of them that's missing that they're connecting with in the creature. And the truth is they already have it as an image bearer. I've already have everything. My perception of who I am, complete as a man or a woman, is a perception based on deficits in places where I wasn't affirmed, wasn't loved, and those deficits becoming sexualized in puberty. And then what happens to a deficit is once it's sexualized, then we connect in that way. And the lie is that's who I am because my emotions and my body and everything has gotten involved in something. And so suddenly that's who I am. Not true. Just because a body responds to something doesn't make it who you are. It means you have a body that responds. And so what makes it complicated for them is once they engage, it's like the sins committed against them. the things that people do to promote this trans identity in them and push on them and push them into things where they alter their bodies. Part of that is the sins against them, and part of that's the sins against themselves. When you've got those things working, you're going to have people who are are bankrupt in their sense of who they are, that they're not going to have a good sense of who they are. They have been sinned against by the people who promoted it and pushed it and who gave them shots and tried to get them to transition. Many of the people that were in that spot were not just people voluntarily saying, "Oh, I think I'm this." It was a loaded agenda. When you have to try to ask when you're trying to ask a 5-year-old and you're trying to say that my 5-year-old doesn't know whether they wanna be a boy or a girl, that's an agenda, and the agenda is diabolic at its core, and it's meant to destroy identity and who we believe we are as men and women. And if the enemy does that, he has sidelined and bankrupt a generation if that's all that they were able to access and that's all that was happening to them. Does that make sense? You, if you want to destroy a chicken, scramble the egg early inside, because the earlier you introduce the trauma, the more damage you do, so that what comes out is so disfigured, it doesn't represent the very thing that it is. That's what the enemy's going after with all of that. And so here we are, people coming out of that, people meeting Jesus and seeing things shifted in them and coming out of these places they've been transitioning. All right, so now we've already had this forward movement, right? There's been a lot of forward revival movement. The baptism revival was a significant and continues to be a significant thing. You can see baptism stuff going on across the world. You can see people in the streets for Jesus across the world. Italy, the Netherlands, everywhere. You're going to see it on your Instagram feed. If you just start liking any of those things, you're going to see it everywhere. So, in a place where you already have forward motion, and you're moving this continuum because the righteous standard is being raised. The enemies come in like a flood, and this righteous standard is being raised in the land. And the righteous standard is being provoked by catastrophic Kairos moment things. Some of them Kairos, some of them diabolic, but Kairos ultimately in the end. And here's the example. Yes, the enemy took out Charlie Kirk. Absolutely diabolic, major threat, not only in the conservative realm, but also primarily in the biblical realm as a believer, who he was as a believer and his ability to articulate what he was able to articulate was just uncanny. Everything I watch of him now, and I've seen him a lot before, is just brilliant, 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 brilliant man. Trump would really like him, and he really did like him, and he would say things probably like, "He's a smart man." He always likes smart people. Um, but what you're seeing with him is something that we're not gonna stop seeing, okay? It has only just begun. Everybody's saying it. I'm not saying anything nobody's saying I'm not saying already. Nothing profoundly prophetic here. Everybody already sees it. That literally, that the seed, the verse I started out with, unless his seed dies, I'm not saying he needed to die. What I'm saying is because of what the enemy did, and because Jesus gets everything out of, he takes every opportunity in death to bring life. Okay. So nothing gets lost in the kingdom, right? Nothing is going to ever get wasted in the kingdom. Nothing ever, ever, ever gets wasted. He was a martyr, and the martyr's blood does not get wasted. Trust me, Jesus, as you all know, the blood of martyrs screams to heaven, and heaven responds in huge ways to the blood of martyrs. It's part of what has made this accelerated suddenly, plowman overtaking the reaper, Amos 9. The reason we're in this Amos 9 economy that we're in, where the plowman overtakes the reaper, and we get to see The world turned upside down where things are going to start happening so fast in the kingdom because of kingdom advancement that our head is going to spin. The reason we're in an accelerated kingdom economy that we're in right now is because of the blood of martyrs that went before us and everything that was sown in every previous age before us. It's the parable of the 1159er coming in and getting paid the same. So, the way we get into a heavy reaping economy in the kingdom is because so much has been sown that we didn't sow into. How do you get a multi billion soul harvest? There's so much that's been sown and moved forward into the era we're in. It used to be one of my favorite, it still is for such a time as this, the Esther, verse, for such a time as this, you've been created. There has never been a more exciting time to be alive on the planet than the time we're living in right now because of the place that we get to enter into the equation. And so much has been rolled forward already. So when the enemy does catastrophic events that interrupt Chronos, then what happens when the enemy does that is Romans 8:28 and John 12:24 begin to kick in. Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit, right? So Charlie, the enemy, came in with this catastrophic event that God is going to work all things together for good in the ultimate bigger picture sense, right? The enemy did what the enemy did. Now the Father does what the Father does. And what the Father does with that is he multiplies in righteousness the things that will begin to explode. Literally, it's not ironic that the name of his organization is the Turning Point. He is a turning point seed that went into the ground that will now produce, and I'm not saying anything new, everybody's saying it, is going to produce life on steroids. Present continuous. I truly believe that we will never be the same. So we've had this progressive thing going. We went to the furthest end of the continuum out here on the pendulum, right? We moved into all the things that ultimately, historically, a culture dies when it gets into pedophilia and sex with the dead and all the things that are that are the furthest, most grotesque, heinous things that happen in a culture. When a culture progresses to that point, they usually die historically. We have hit that pendulum swing all the way out. We're there. And then in the middle of all of the depravity and all of the lawlessness and the lawless parade that we've been watching, we have these events. And those are the ones that I was outlining earlier. Then we see God break in through The Chosen, through Let Us Worship, through, universities having spontaneous revivals outbreak where nobody's in charge. So there has been a progressiveness to what's going on. So prior to Charlie Kirk, there was already the soil was loaded and pregnant because there had been so much being sown into revival that would be unstoppable. So my eschatology is very simple. It is a wild party to the end, no matter how dark it gets. I don't care about the rapture. I don't care about any of those things. I care about living my life, seeing the kingdom of God on heaven, on earth as it is in heaven, and seeing that progressive Isaiah 60 arise and shine, your light has come, that the deep darkness has covered the people, but the light. So, my thing is, we are going to get brighter. This is where the greater works come in, where the greater works. You are the sign, you are the wonder, you are the manifestation, you are all those things, and unusual miracles and things beginning to happen. So we're going to see all of that. So no matter how dark darkness gets, there's always going to be the light is always going to get brighter. And you're going to have things that intersect Chronos times at various junctures, things that are There are things that cannot be stopped that God is going to do that cannot be stopped in terms of what happens in the righteous standard being raised in the land. He has things that he is doing and breaking forth the righteousness in the land and the earth and raising up this billion soul harvest that we're going to reap, that we will reap as part of his inheritance. Those things are in motion. Then, when you have an event like what happened with Charlie, right? The sleeping giant post-COVID was already awoken. I there was already ever since COVID, there has been, if you look at statistics, people that never used to pray before pray. There has been an awakening in our culture and around the world post-COVID anyway. And so on in the middle of something that's already been awakened and already awakening present continuous, when this thing happened, he literally becomes the turning point seed in the ground. It's God is going to use this one and we're seeing it. I mean, and it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. The people that are coming awake, people that didn't necessarily even ascribe to him are coming awake. What it has done is it has confronted and stunned us in such a way that everybody, even people on the bad side, are evaluating themselves. That's what these kind of moments, when God turns it into a Kairos moment, that's what it actually does. It provokes us, and it provokes us deeply, like in ways that don't stop. And so what you've got is a generation of people who are being profoundly provoked. You're going to see a lot of people that have been operating in the camp of the wicked flip and turn and move into the camp of the righteous overnight. It's already happening. People who never thought about God before, who never even thought about it. What you had was this shining example of what, I mean, one of the purest souls who emanated in everything that he did, as much as people like to say it wasn't true, it is true, treated everybody with dignity. But what he did was he proclaimed his faith. For the last 4 years, I was hearing somewhere the uptick in what he talked about moved from less politics and more about Jesus. I mean, so literally proclaiming Jesus and biblical everything and every kind of interaction that he was having with people and every kind of speech that he was giving, he was preaching the gospel. I mean, he just never stopped. And so because of all, I don't fully understand it, how God, or why certain things become what they are, but we were already so provoked on a level and so awakened on a level that when this happened, what it did was it just put it into warp drive, warp speed. And the depth of it is going to be something that we are not going to stop seeing how deep it goes for a long time, because the awakening that's happening is, this is like a one of the most catalytic prime times of awakening that I think we have seen in our culture so far to date is now. People hungry for God, people reevaluating where they've been, evil people, people that have been operating in the camp of the devil, flipping on a dime. You're going to see that happen over and over and over again. There's this huge impetus, and God is going to get so much out of this seed that it's going to be remarkable and astonishing on so many levels. It's worldwide right now. The sowing into this last act of the play, if you will. And I'm not saying that, tomorrow it all ends. I'm just saying, all I know is that, the end is a long time coming in terms of even the way it plays out. Like, what does that actually mean? I don't know. A lot of people want to say, "Oh, Jesus is coming tomorrow." I don't know, but it doesn't change the way I live. My only point in that is this, is that there are things happening right now that are so provocative in the kingdom of heaven on earth that the ripples and the effects of them are going to continue to multiply. It's going to become bigger and bigger and bigger. There is a momentum that has been released to push that pendulum. That's when you see a reformation happen in a culture. You're going to see the church is going to grow exponentially in these next few years. I mean, exponentially grow. And by the church, I don't mean the building. By the church, I mean the body of Christ. I mean people coming into the kingdom is what I mean. So the implications of all of it are way beyond my pay grade. And I think we're going to see it on multiple levels. And it's already been something that was sown into. This has been in the making for a long time. And this event, this tragic event, has become a catalyst for righteousness in ways that I haven't seen before. I wasn't a kid in the '70s, so I didn't see the Jesus movement, but I was alive during that time. So, it wasn't ironic that we saw the Jesus Revolution movie come out during that same time with The Chosen and everything. It's like it's a picture of what is happening. People are turning to Jesus like crazy, and it's very easy, and they are being provoked by the Holy Spirit in unprecedented ways. So all I know is that the turning point for the nation, for the world in many ways is already here. And it's going to be a progressive reality that we continue to see unfold in the years to come. This isn't like the end of a news cycle thing. This is something God's doing. We may get to the end of a news cycle in terms of the conversation you see about Charlie, etc. But what God is doing in it is not going to be an end of a news cycle. It's going to be something present, progressive, continuous, because it's all been in the making. We look at how much the enemy has had in all of their very planned, very orchestrated moves as if the kingdom of heaven could not outmove them. The kingdom of heaven wins, and we're watching it, and we're going to be alive during a time where we're going to see worldwide revival in our lifetime. In our lifetime, like even now, it's happening. It's not going to stop. It's only going to grow. And it's going to get easier and easier and easier to see people come into the kingdom. It only gets easier because the glory of heaven is being infused into this planet and the righteous standard is being raised. And it's going to continue to be raised, present, continuous till the end. This is an ongoing awakening. One level of awakening to another level, to another level, to another level. And we're going to watch it begin to impact every part of our culture. For such a time as this, heaven has orchestrated all these things. So I'll leave it at that. Um, Blessings, and I will we'll pick it up again.